Buenas noches, good evening. I'm Jose de Jesus, as many of you know, Associate Director here at the Centro. We're about to begin our event. You can applaud. Couple of announcements. Again, as I said earlier, if you haven't signed in, don't forget to sign in on your way out. We want to make sure that we can obviously justify these events, and one of those factors that we look at is the numbers that are here and the diversity of the crowd. So we need to indicate that. And we have, of course, our iPads to make it easy for all of you. That's one. Two, we have in our semester events, upcoming event on becoming Julia de Burgos, presentation of a book by Vanessa Perez Rosario. That's for upcoming December 4th, right here. You're all welcome to come and bring more people to the event. Obviously, there are a lot of celebratory events in the centenary of Julia de Burgos going on all the time now. This is one of the key people who has contributed to the scholarship on Julia. There's refreshments anytime you feel a little bit, or afterwards, by all means. Okay. Let me introduce first our moderator, introducer, and respondent, Dr. Another Cruz-malave, who's the director of Modern Puerto University. We will introduce our speaker, and we'll get this show on the road.
All right. I am very pleased and very honored to be here and to have the opportunity to introduce Urayoan Noel's latest book. But before I do that, let me just say that, of course, that Urayoan has an extensive bibliography. He has published multiple books before this one, and some of them are high-density politics, Los Días Porosos, El Enunciador, etc. But I'm actually here to speak about today's book, the book that Urayoan just published. And let me just begin by saying that, today we're here to celebrate a great accomplishment. The publication of what is, in my estimation, the best book on New York, Puerto Rican or Nuyorican literature from 1960s to the contemporary scene of spoken word or slam. Urayoan Noel's Invisible Movement, Nuyorican Poetry from the 60s to Slam, recently published by the University of Iowa Press. Invisible Movement is not only the most thoroughly researched and informed book on this fascinating and much debated subject, it is also a meditation and a bold proposal on what we might call, what I would call, surely as a shorthand term and certainly not as a quote from Urayoan's carefully nuanced prose, what I would call, excuse me, Urayoan, the Puerto Rican condition.
Do it.
By this I mean that condition both of invisibility and hypervisibility that defines Puerto Rican's historical reality or being in the world. That blurred in-betweenness of spectacular notoriety on the one hand and outcast, outlaw, abjection on the other, that determines not so much who we are, but how we are seen and reacted to in public in the world. Between those two mortal enemies of Puerto Rican agency and life possibilities, Urayoan proposes Nuyorican literature and art moves and mediates. The New York Puerto Rican or Nuyorican poetic movement is thus, in his account, more than an appendage, or to say it in the language of the 1970s political renaissance, it's not the cultural arm of the revolution. It is instead the place or no place or utopia where the tensions between Puerto Ricans' hypervisibility and abjection are worked out in the hopes of producing not so much a solution or an escape, but a network of roots, alternative rhythms and logics, a contrapuntal dynamic that puts into conversation, into dialogue, all those inchoate, fragmented, stuttering, or balbuciantes, and uncomfortably dislocated ways in which we, to the embarrassment of some of our intellectuals, our traditional intellectuals, not the ones who are here, we as Puerto Ricans are not. All those ways in which we are not. A comprehensive, though not linear or exhaustive account of the movements, oscillations, dynamics, or counterpoints generated by Puerto Ricans in their attempt to bregar, as Arcadio Diaz-Quiñones would say, to deal with or negotiate those intractable tensions of marked hypervisibility and outcast outlaw abjection. Invisible movement does not offer a narrative of transformation from a New York Puerto Rican or Nuyorican countercultural 1970s resistant aesthetics that attempts to decolonize by calling on colonial subjects to withdraw from the system and its mass media cultural industries to a more supple, ambiguous, and playful postmodern aesthetics that assumes the market and its sanctioned spectacles in order to create alternative counterpublics, as Ralph Dalio and Elena Machado, among others, have theorized. It doesn't do that. But that long sentence, it doesn't do that. What does it do, right? Nor does it posit a constant, seamless evolution or development of a popular street-based aesthetics over time, from its foundation in the 1960s to its resurgence or revival in the multicultural slam and spoken word poetics of the 1990s, through the mediating agency of the Nuyorican Poets Café, the way that Algarín would narrate this tale in his preface to the anthology Out Loud. Doesn't do that either. Instead, okay, here it goes. Instead, working against the important historical context or frames proposed by Juan Flores, Arlene Davila, and Ed Morales on the evolution and transformation of New York City as a diasporic, neoliberal, and globally multicultural urban space, Urayoan sets out to identify and analyze how New York, Puerto Rican, or Nuyorican poets have negotiated the disparate and mutually contradictory ways that were meant to render them silent, to annihilate them by wittily and astutely articulating the fragmented, dislocated, blurred, and in-between pieces of their lives in virtuoso, contrapuntal expressions where language is mediated through the body and constantly displaced on and off the page to other alternative linguistic, musical, visual, corporeal registers, intonations, mannerisms, vocalizations, gestures, and yes, sweat. If New York Puerto Rican expression has been considered by some stunted, balbuciante, stuttering, and weak, we may surmise from Urayoan's book, it is because it has been solely considered from the vantage point of one of these fragments, a judge lacking in relation to some pure, predetermined foundation or norm, and not from the perspective of the articulate and resistant counterpoint of registers its authors engender in performance as a response to a mutually contradictory, paradoxical social condition of hypervisibility and outcast abjection. So it is that Urayoan's great achievement in invisible movement is to give us, for the first time, I would say, and perhaps I think would agree too, for the first time, dense descriptions of these performances of Nuyorican poetry that identify its resistant, mobile counterpoints, restoring thus their multiple references on and off the page, their virtuosity and their wit. Certainly, by temperament and in his own creative work, Urayoan identifies with the wit, dexterity, and virtuosity of these New York Puerto Rican performances. A virtuosity that in his reading would seek to sidestep or overwhelm the encroaching condition of spectral invisibility under which Puerto Ricans create, labor, and love. Indeed, invisible movement is itself a virtuoso performance of Nuyorican aesthetics, the grandest contrapuntal articulation of poetic, political, theoretical, performative, and visual text ever attempted by a critic of New York Puerto Rican literature. And yet, though early on, as we as readers are encouraged to displace in his book, to displace the poetics of abjection of P.D. Thomas's Down These Mean Streets in favor of the humorous, playful performances of Thomas's poems in his CD, Every Child's a Poet, and the engaged, collaborative, community-oriented activism of his later novels, abjection keeps rearing its spectral head in the figure not only of one of the founding members of the Nuyorican Poets Café, Miguel Piñero, but in the contemporary poetry of the brilliantly moving wordsmith, Willie Perdomo as well. Much before Nuyorican poetry and much before Slavoj Žižek would critique deconstruction's penchant for linguistic, discursive displacement, confronting it with the hard kernel of the real, the great Latin American virtuoso, the Cuban neo-Baroque of master José Lezama Lima had taught us that writing, if it is to be effective against the strictures of the law that is, that determines the politics of visibility in Latin America for populations both marked and rendered invisible by the West, it must reach beyond virtuosity to an area that is resistant because it is inexpressible, where writing, visual art, and performance meet, clash, and break. And it is here where I think that invisible movement can also teach us a lesson perhaps contra la letra, against the grain. For it is, for all its virtuoso contrapuntal performance, invisible movement also registers in the Nuyorican poet's struggle between hypervisibility and abjection, something that is neither the outcast spectral body nor the infinite and artful displacement of signs, but a trace, the ephemeral residue that the hard labor of the poet's performance leaves in its wake, something unrecoverable yet insistent and durable, perdurable, that incites us with its resistant absence and loss. Uncannily, Jose Muñoz, in what would become his last book, Cruising Utopia, shortly published before his untimely death, argued that all performance is a sort of not vanishing point, elusive and lost in the very instant that it is produced, yet always insistently calling from that utopian out there, from that loss. Urayoan's outstanding book, Invisible Movement, incites us both to recover the virtuoso counterpoints that the Nuyorican poetic imagination has woven out of the contradictory dislocations and fragmentations of diaspora's invisibility. And to listen as well for the call of that elusive and resistant residue that New York Puerto Rican performance does not fail incessantly to produce and prefer. Congratulations, Rayoan, and thank you for such provocations and incitations. I hope that we all heed, I guess I'm speaking for all of us, I hope that we all heed your brilliant call to continue that contrapuntal dialogue on and off the page that you and Nuyorican literature so eloquently invite us to. Thank you.
Wow, I think I should just go home now. I don't have a lot to add after that. Thank you, Arnaldo, as always, so generous, so beautiful, so complex. I remember reading Arnaldo's essays early on, thinking, how the heck do you write about poetry and performance? How the heck do you write about being Puerto Rican in New York, right? How the heck do you turn this into an archive, a corpus, something that becomes manageable? And I kept coming back to Arnaldo's early essays, just kept asking questions, making things more complex, deeper, right? More difficult, right? And that difficulty became something I could hold on to, right? That difficulty was Nuyorican poetry's, but it was also ours. The two people really early on were Arnaldo and then Ed Morales, coming from a place of kind of the cultural difficulty of being Puerto Rican and the ways in which Nuyorican, the ways in which Ed's journalism also mapped those difficulties. So, Arnaldo maybe more from a space of theory and Ed from a space of cultural critique were touchstones for me as a grad student, thinking, what can I do beyond a dissertation? How can this be a project that also speaks to, right, what I found so compelling about this poetry? And I'm glad to have a couple of the poets here in the house tonight. So hopefully it's a tribute to the complexity of the poetry, but also to the complexity of my thoughts, and to all the people who helped me figure out and not resolve my complexities, but figure out an appropriate language for them, and Arnaldo, chief among them. Gracias. I guess there are a lot of, a big part of the book is kind of institutional, right? I was thinking about the complexities of institutional politics also in the era, right? One thing that I figured out in just talking to scholars who did Chicano poetry, for example, was how there really wasn't a kind of Nuyorican poetry program, right? You have the Plan Espiritual de Aztlán for the Chicano movement, but other than the Young Lords, right, which was just the Young Lords and is not reflective of the entirety of the Puerto Rican movement, right? There really was not, right, a kind of Nuyorican plan. It seemed that it was in the bodies, in the performances, right? That a politics kind of made itself, right? So I think that led me in this kind of anti-programmatic direction, right? And also in thinking about how provisional institutional space could be. One thing that the Nuyorican poetry has in common with, say, Chicano poetry is the role that poets play, right? In starting, right, Puerto Rican studies programs, right? In thinking about the curriculum and thinking about institutional politics, right? So one of those rare times when poetry matters, right? In this kind of hyper public way, and I think we're here at a wonderful space like Centro, largely as a result of some of those pioneering struggles, right? And so that breakthrough, wow, this is kind of about institutional politics, and I started thinking, Bonafide, you probably can speak to this, but it was about 10 years ago when the big what are the politics of slam debate had started. There was a slam poetry thing, and had brought this new energy, right, and to a new generation of poets. But it made us ask a lot of difficult questions about what does it mean that Nuyorican poetry is now a global commodity, right, as opposed to a historically specific community, right? And I thought, wow, so slam is kind of another institution or another alternative institution, right? It's counter-institutional as well. And that insight let me kind of link the foundational poets of the 60s and 70s to the more recent poets of the past couple of decades, and think about their shared difficulties, right? And try to honor that difficulty in my work, and also honor the ways in which it had affected me as a poet myself. Just to conclude this narrative, I remember going to the Nuyorican Poets Cafe early on and asking all the poets, ¿Dónde está el libro? Where's the book, right? I'm a scholar, I'm a geek, I need to know more. Whom do I need to read to find out where this comes from, right? What the history is? There's no book. What do you mean there's no book? There are anthologies, but there's no book, right? And so I remember begging everybody, I don't want to be the island Puerto Rican who writes the Nuyorican poetry book, somebody write it, right? And eventually I thought, I don't think anybody's going to write it, right? At least in the time I want to get my answers, right? So it became eventually, grudgingly, right? And with some trepidation, it became this project that far exceeded, right, the kind of institutional limits of the PhD, and I'm happy to be able to continue the conversation. So actually, I'd like to just recognize the presence of Puerto Melendez here. Thank you so much, Puerto. There are a number of other distinguished folks, but allow me here to honor Puerto in particular, just because I think Puerto's been doing this, right, Nuyorican poetry, right, from the beginning, right, pretty much before anybody else, right. But I think your work was a kind of discovery for me of the archive, right. I knew you from the kind of poetry community, and I remember just stumbling across, right, street poetry at Centro and saying, wow, this is so powerful. This needs to be out there, right. This is before your new book, right, had recovered some of this early work, and thinking, wow, this is part of what it means to archive. Also, soon after that, I read Schomburg's The Negro Digs Up His Past, and thought, wow, this is part of the project also, is what Schomburg calls moving away from controversy, right, and towards the dust of digging, right. His idea is controversy is kind of cheap politics, right. The archive is more than enough politics. There's so much needs to be recovered first, right, and so that became a kind of structuring principle for me. So you're wonderfully one that I discovered, I say with somewhat embarrassment, having seen you read forever and ever and considered you, right, a pioneering figure. I discovered largely archivally, right, and I thought it was important. So give one to Centro. I was able to actually go into that work as a Ford Foundation postdoctoral fellow at Centro, so I want to take this opportunity to thank Centro for their ongoing support. With all the chismes and all the revoluces and all the causes, right? It's important that this space remains and that we can do some of that digging. That's so important. So I thought on that note that I would maybe start off by reading a very brief section on Papoletto's work, and maybe have Papoletto share something with us based on that. And then I'll maybe read something a little bit from the end of the book, trying to think about post-Nuyorican futures, and I'm very, very uneasy about that because I don't know what those futures are, right? So it's more of a kind of riff, right, that we can all pick up on together. So I'm thinking, as Arnaldo beautifully distilled, you can just talk to him and he'll give you the gist of the book, right? Save yourselves like $55. It's another other question, right? The question of when you say, I'm publishing a book on Puerto Ricans, right? University Press editors seem to run and hide. When you say I'm publishing a book on poetry, people run and hide. When you say both, that's a whole other, wow, this is yet another lesson on institutional politics coming from the publishing landscape. So I'm happy to talk about that, right? And to fold that into our conversation. So I'm thinking, as Arnaldo points out here, on this dialectic of visibility and invisibility as it relates to Papoletto's poetry. Melendez's poetry from the era works within and through this dialectics of visibility, invisibility. It is already there in the title of his self-published debut pamphlet, Casting Long Shadows, 1970, and in the preponderance of visual images and metaphors in Have You Seen Liberation? Interestingly, no question mark at the end of Have You Seen Liberation? We can talk about that too. Also self-published. The last poem of Have You Seen Liberation addresses a, quote, little lost child who is, quote, praying to a God you've never seen, and becomes, quote, a prayer for Malcolm and Don Pedro, a reference to Malcolm X and Pedro Albizu Campos, two figures joined at the hip in the imagination of the Puerto Rican movement as exemplars of the diasporic revolutionary nationalist spirit, and of course both were also central to the early Young Lords Party, whose early incarnation, what's called the Sociedad de Campos. The poem goes on to invoke the nationalist poet and political prisoner Lolita Lebrón, wishing the lost child a good night and, quote, dreams of our struggle. Qué bonito, Paporeto. The utopian night signifies both an end to the struggle and its renewal come the new day. The title poem, meanwhile, stages a struggle between the stasis and movement, between seeing and doing, between documenting the revolutionary struggle and becoming one with it. So the poet is kind of inside and outside political space, which I find fascinating. Thus, we are asked to see the barrio's mothers looking for their children, quote, through windows of painless frames. That's deep, Papo, windows of painless frames. In what becomes a mise en abîme of bodies watching bodies watching bodies. The spatial frame, which in other poets had served as a way to blur sensations and geographies, lets Melendez zoom out like a telescopic lens from barrio to city to nation. Quote, have you seen the Puerto Ricans in El Barrio, South Bronx, New York, America? Right, so kind of zooming out. The exploration of visibility and visibilities continued in street poetry and other poems, 1972. Published by a small press named Barlenmere House. They also did Quincy Troop's first book, right? So kind of interesting editorial project there. In the poem Oye Mundo, Melendez fashions the barrio as a free zone of panda-esporic sensual pleasures, where Puerto Rican cuchifritos and lechon coexist alongside chitterlings and black-eyed peas and cornbread. And they're defined by, quote, la música latina africana. Now that's weird because Puerto came to my class at NYU and told me, I don't do Latino, right? But there's a shout out to the Latino there, right? So we can talk about that, right? Kind of situational identities, perhaps, right? This constant fusion of Puerto Rican and African American cultures reflects the political and poetic climate of the day, right? Thinking of, say, Young Lords and Black Panthers, but it also echoes Melendez's personal experience growing up in East Harlem around a large African American community. You've spoken about that in various places. Though the book initially dramatizes a flaneur-ish existence as, quote, I can't do this like he does, a Puerto Rican bum sipping Puerto Rican rum. It turns out that in irony Baudelaire might appreciate, the streets the poets thought he owned end up owning him. Lost myself, my identity, found myself on a subway platform somewhere in tunnels of hell. Life. The warning here that what the street gives, the street takes away, is in keeping with Melendez's cautious barrio poetics. Nowhere is his rethinking of visibility more definitive than in Message to Urban Sightseers, a standout poem from street poetry and one of his major works. In this hilarious and compelling poem, Melendez addresses a mythic sightseer or tourist from small-town America and satirizes his or her unwillingness to confront the speaker and his family's living conditions in the barrio, and I'll do a little bit of this, because maybe Puerto can do it better, right? Hey you, sightseer from small-town nowhere, US of A, bring your head down, your eyes off those tall business buildings. Look here, sightseer, sightsee, I'm a sight to be seen by your sore eyes. The speaker offers to serve as a tour guide through the barrio and anticipates the sightseer's amazement at his and his family's and the barrio's living conditions, and concludes with a manic, desperate plea. Look, goddammit, I'm interesting! Even as it serves as a plea for visibility, Message to Urban Sightseers undercuts the power of the sightseer's gaze, contrasting his or her cluelessness and implicit condescension with the speaker and the barrio's survivalist savvy and creativity. Because a sightseer finds it cute that their house is so small that the speaker's youngest brother sits on their dog. That, quote, you can sit in the living room with your feet in my bedroom and your elbow in the kitchen, and that they must navigate the rats and roaches and sewers of an urban landscape that Wolfgang Binder describes as refuse Americana. The speaker's demand is not merely to be seen, but to be felt. So the sightseer's eyes are sore from what he or she has just seen. Visibility without reciprocal pain is like an affectless documentary, like the ethnographic distance in animated Oscar Lewis's La Vida. It is no visibility at all. So this idea of a kind of affect. Even as it participates in the visibility politics of the Puerto Rican movement, Melendez's poetry insists on the untranslatability of the street and the barrio. And thus it foreshadows the self-reflexive ironies of a book like Willie Perdomo's Smoking Lovely, 2003, where the poet becomes a guide to a neoliberal city. in this sense, Melendez's early work embodies the dialectics of visibility in the contradictions of the raced and classed street. So Puerto, when you come up and share something with us, we just put this together last minute. It would be fun to hear Puerto do a message for urban sightseers. Un aplauso para Jesús Puerto.
To address everyone. Gracias. Message Service Sightseers was written in 1967. I was 17 years old.
Whoa, putting us to shame.
Yeah, sorry. And it was the summer, and my friend Babyface had been shot just a few weeks earlier by a police officer. He was hit in the neck because we were hanging out drinking beer and in a lot, you know, in the South Bronx, and these cops, you know, came up on us, and the guy said he tripped and his gun went off. Anyway, he hit Babyface. So it was that crazy summer, you know, and I was just sitting down reflecting on things. So I wrote this. One thing I want to say, because I want you, this is your show, I don't want to take up your time. I just want to say that Pedro Pietri and I, you know, we did a lot of research. People don't think that we did, you know, but we studied Dadaism and the Surrealists, you know, we were into,
For surreal?
Yeah, we were into Surrealism. We used to go to the 8th Street Theater and watch all of Cocteau's films, like at 2 o'clock in the morning, you know, and, you know, we'd take our own stash, you know. So it was, you know, it was when you could smoke in the theater, you know.
Glory days.
Yeah, right. And, but there's 2 things I want to say about your book, because see, the thing is that Pedro and I, we'd go to the library on 42nd Street because they had like a social science section, and that's where we got the books on the beats. And we would study the beat movement, because the Nuyorican poets movement is a post-beat movement. Yeah, a lot of people don't look at it like that, but that's basically what it is. They took poetry out of the university and put it all over the place, and that, you know, so then we were encountered by that. So Pedro and I used to always talk about your book. Yeah, we used to say, one of these days there's got to be a book that talks about, you know, like the beats. And that's, to me, that's what you did. You made that. That's, you know, one of those books is where I found Moon Over McDougal Street by Richard Davidson. That's a great poem. You know, when I was young, what is it? When I was born and born I was into life as secure as a rug. And my father loved me with a briefcase love. Oh, God. Anyway, so that's where I discovered him. And then I met him, Richard Davidson, Bedwell's house, you know. So here's Message to Sightseers, written summer of '67. I just want to see how many pages it is in this book. If I show you my other book, in street poetry and other poems, I don't have it with me, but the book falls apart. But right there, my thumbprints are right at Sightseer for like 30 years. Hey, you sightseer from small town nowhere, US of A. Bring your head down, your eyes off those tall business buildings. Look at here, sightseer, sightsee. I am a sight to be seen by yours four eyes. Sure, I'll be your guide. Wanna send a friend a picture postcard? Here, take this one. That's me, my brothers, my mother, my father, my aunt, my uncle, my sisters, our cousins, and our dog. We all live very near one another, the same apartment. Oh, you think it's cute the way my youngest brother sits on our dog. We don't. Actually, he thinks Rover is a horse. No kidding. He really thinks Rover is a horse. He wants to be a cowboy. I think he'll be a soldier riding horseback on some tank. Do you really like the family pose? It was taken on our fire escape. It collapsed just as we all entered the house. Nobody hurt. But since last summer, the people across the street have had the ugly view of our apartment. That there wall is our wall-to-wall nothingness. Last winter, when it snowed, all the kids from the neighborhood came up to my house and we skied in my living room. Come on, sightseer, I'll take you to my house. You can sit in the living room with your feet in my bedroom and your elbow in the kitchen. Come dinner time, we all can gather around the table, the floor, the bed, the fire escapes, the halls, the toilet, the bathtub, and eat our food. If we run out of plates, we'll use the dog bowl, the ashtrays, the rats, poison dish, the pots and pans, all corners on the table in our hands to cup our share of 1.37 can of spaghetti divided by family. Come on, sightseer, don't be a fool, take advantage of our hospitality, or don't leave. I ain't tell you about me doing homework while roaches gather round to get their education. Kinda makes me feel like Dr. Doolittle. And when we flood the sewers, turn on the hydrants and make like Joe's Beach, while junkies taking people off so they can get their daily fed. Hey you, sightseer, from small town nowhere, US of A, bring your head down, your eyes off those tall business buildings. Look at here, sightseer, sightsee, I am a sight to be seen by your sore eyes, by the eyes of the yo-yo, by the eyes of the world, by the eyes of the stars and moon. Look at here, look, God damn it, I'm interesting.
Now I feel so bad about having read snippets from that. Totally embarrassing. So I didn't know that was 67, Pableto. You're like you were like the Rambo, the Nuyorican Rambo, right? You or Victor Cruz, one of you, you're fighting each other for that title, right?
No, well, Victor's 2 years older than me.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Whoa. So there we have it. There you go.
He was doing stuff before me. You know, what we were all doing. I don't know. We were there.
I said we were there.
That's good. Well, I think the question I think of archive was really powerful to me, and then just stumbling across artifacts from the era. Right? I remember asking you, Pableto, about the El Grupo CD. Right? So there is this kind of performance archive. But it's very, very provisional, right, and kind of almost these historical accidents through which certain documents from the era survive, right? So I think part of the book is also working through this kind of post-Diana Taylor archive versus repertoire, right, and thinking about what kinds of embodied knowledge, right, that poetry makes possible. I thought it was for that reason important to have someone like Pableto here sharing the work. And I also think about all the places in which your work circulates, right? We think of the Nuyorican Poets Cafe, but one thing I discovered in talking to all of you for the book and then in continuing the research is how many other spaces and under how many other labels, right, a lot of this poetry circulated, right? I think about how the work has been done on the Puerto Rican students movement, for example, right? And how a number of the early poets were affiliated with that, right? Your own work with El Grupo, right? And with other groups in the era, right? Education in general, I think, is an aspect of the poetry that has not been sufficiently examined. So in reality, we have these kind of iconic spaces that over-determine the poetry somewhat, but I think as your work from the era reveals, right, the conception of the political in this work was significantly broader. On that note, one of the questions that I ended up asking myself, right, is what, if any, lessons or models, right, can we get from Nuyorican poetry to apply, right, to other diasporic communities and maybe to the kind of future of the Puerto Rican diaspora, right? And I know some folks, there are actual folks who are, Chicago Puerto Ricanists, right, who can do this, or Orlando Puerto Ricanists, Patricia Silva, right, folks who can do this work in a much more dedicated fashion than I can, but I thought it was important in the conclusion of the book to at least show, right, what some of these affinities, right, could be, and what ways that model might work, but also might not work. Right, and so I thought I would show you just a clip. This is some folks may know La Tere with part of the group Rebeldias, for hip hop group Rebeldias, which is a kind of interestingly translocal group, right, with a strong Bronx presence, but working in Chicago as well. So I thought I would play this and maybe read the part of the book that looks at this particular. This particular video, right? This is about 2000. There's actually different versions of it. This I think is 2011, right? and it's called the official video on YouTube. We can talk about how you determine, right, what the official archive is in the era of YouTube, right? Because it allows you all these resources for finding out, right, who posts the clip, right, what kind of formalized archive can it be or should it be a part of is a whole other, right, it's a whole other mess, right? So actually, some of my new work is looking at kind of digital Latino context and also digital institutional politics as they relate to archives and new kinds of archiving, largely around the logistical issues I had with this book. I need to do something, think about a more expansive way of thinking about the archive, and we can talk about that if you like. So this is La Terre, Crush. I think it's got to be loud, but it can't be too loud, so let me know if it's too loud.
It's cold, it's cold, it's cold. It's like for the fight for the inner city queen is awakened from my soul. Embracing how it feels, I hope you're reinforced. The overrule the fact she has always been guarded. From blind to the joy, she's been ducked in a promise. And ancestors made me for the Lord out of mountain. They swore on the bloodline, no one will cross it. Until I reach the status of a queen in my own place. So now I make a move, but I move at my own pace. But told me that when they speak, it's mothers with no faith. They're building on the beam, they believe they could drink free. Teachers to follow lies, they believe they could bring me. So now I stand here, he's bitter.
Iconic Plaza Urbano in Chicago.
Remember the real one of our age, cause I'm chosen.
I never been shy, tired, been shy, really sang with a mic right. I'm still get your mind right. Shots in the jam with a timeline. I never been shy, tired, been shy, really sang with a mic right. I'm still get your mind right.
Humble Park in the house.
Can't hear what it do, it's Lottie. Killer to the liver like a hot socket. Born in the shot, conceived in a beat. Raised in the ringer with my brother TC. Now he's alive, 100 at a time. God said so, I'm ready to take the vibe. Bring knowledge to the hood that'll blow your mind. I ain't gotta move fast, I can take my time. I'm a
Let me know.
L-side, G-point. I'm cold with my ice cold soul, never shut down. Hormone, these boys, just know I deserve this though. Have to throw all the mixtapes as a hit tape back in 6th grade. Studied all the styles, got a dose of the underground downstate. Now my style ain't a similar sound. That inspiration, never let the
Got great flow, right?
Do it on your own. You don't need nobody holding your hand.
I never been shy, tired, been shy, really sang with a mic right. I'm still get your mind right. Shots in the
Cool
jam.
camera work, right? Very YouTube cinema.
Heavy with spirit, lyrical lyrics that I remember. You're peering through individuals. Keep on God, I'm a female, don't die. Bringing the boom, think of my flow like I'm a new. Did he do nigga know you were not begging my body? Cause I'm a female, cause then he was not a Yankee. He gonna touch the
Daddy was not a Yankee.
I'm gonna drink that I need. Just take a moment and breathe. And I'm gonna give you a story of my the future is gonna know. And I'm pointing into the sky cause the love is always before me.
I never been shy, tired, been shy, really sang with a mic right. I'm still get your mind right. Shots in the jam with a timeline. I never been shy, tired, been shy, really sang with a mic right. I'm still get your mind right. Shots in the jam with a timeline. She can show them one.
In a video like that, Pablo, you get a video like that.
Yeah, sure, why not? I can't talk that fast.
What are you gonna do?
Only when I'm mad. Yes. I like that sort of
Okay, so again, so to say a little bit about this is very exploratory. I'm not a specialist on Chicago, but let's do what we can. So Ana Ramos Ayas argues that Puerto Rican nationalism in Chicago was performed through immediate social practices and material processes that rendered colonialism a palpable quotidian phenomenon related to racism, racial tensions, and urban displacement. And the public practice of poetry has been key to this national performance, as she calls it. Think of the late David Hernandez and his group Street Sounds, right? But also to this hip-hop influenced generation of performance and poetic activism taking shape at Batey Urbano, famous community center, theater, and cafe in Humboldt Park, affiliated with the city's Puerto Rican Cultural Center that features hip-hop and spoken word performances, and its own youth-run radio station. As evident from the 2010 CD, the Batey Urbano Mixtape Volume 1, Batey Urbano poets and performers use hip-hop to fuse a poetics of barrio realism with a project of cultural recovery and political outreach. And you saw that, the Batey, right, the ways in which Taino iconography, right, gets troped at the beginning of the video with the semi, and also the idea of the Batey as the town square, right, so this kind of alternative polis, right? As a musical nationalism of hip-hop meets a Puerto Rican tradition that encompasses everyone from Taino caciques to Albizu Campos. As noted by Flores Gonzalez, Rodriguez, and Rodriguez Muñiz, Batey Urbano emerged partly as a community's response to the threat of displacement, and it uses hip-hop to, quote, develop self-awareness, social awareness, and global awareness among marginalized youth in the Puerto Rican barrio. In her track Crush, a standout from the Batey Urbano mixtape, La Tere, a self-described Afro-Antillean Puerto Rican Boricua activist, songstress, and femc raised in Humboldt Park, that's from her website, and a former member of the rap group Rebeldias, celebrates her Sangre Taína as Cuestión de Pueblo y Esquina. Significantly, her affirmation of the Taino blood follows her declaration that my barrio was never fino because my daddy was not a Yankee, a punning reference to Puerto Rican reggaeton star Daddy Yankee and his 2004 album Barrio Fino, which contained the international hit Gasolina. The pun cleverly conflates imperialism, Daddy was not a Yankee, and neoliberalism, Daddy Yankee's globally commodified rhymes, in order to critique both. In the song's video posted on YouTube and dedicated to the memory of Lolita Lebron, La Tere delivers these lines in front of a mural of Albizu Campos, and also we saw Betances and other folks. Her booming delivery, every bit as rapid fire as fellow Chicago Rican, Mayra del Valle, who I mentioned later on. Crush works as a decolonial feminist critique, poised against the commercialism and crass gender politics of Gasolina, while mining its political potential. And I was amazed by this and kind of Nuyorican feminist poetics, the capacity to kind of tap into what is really radical and liberatory, right, about these male-centered poetries, but then to reinscribe it, right, from the point of view of feminist critique, right, very much what Ansaldúa, right, writes about, the ways in which Chicana movements, right, have to unwrite movimiento, right, even as they're an extension of movimiento themselves, right. So I see what La Tere is doing here is what Wayne Marshall describes as the class and race-conscious lyrics of Gasolina, right. So for all its crudeness, there's a kind of sophisticated class and race-conscious politics to the song, right, as well as its savvy rendering of a variety of Caribbean music genres into what Marshall calls a regionally inflected form of global pop. So the idea that from the kind of radically localized place of Humboldt Park, right, La Tere here is in conversation, right, with both the possibilities but also the pitfalls of this brand of global pop. The syncretic politics of Crush and its staging of a translocal barrio are distilled in the beginning of the video, where a close-up of a traditional Taino semistone gives way to shots of La Tere inside a botanica. Community-rooted, yet defined in opposition to the global circulation of culture and capital, epitomized by Daddy Yankee's selling of his own barrio fino. Crush operates across the local global matrix that defines the Batey Urbano. Its loyalties are clear. The video concludes with a caption reading, Humboldt Park no se vende. The poets and performers of the Batey Urbano scene, like David Hernandez before them, affirm poetry as direct community action against gentrification and displacement in a strategically folklorized yet clear-headed affirmation of identity in its immediacy and materiality. Right? And I have more to say, but I think that gives you an idea of at least potential points of contact given the histories of displacement, right, gentrification, and so on. What's funny, of course, is that like happens a lot in the Puerto Rican movement, right? Chicago invents it, and New York steals it away, right? Thinking of the Young Lords, thinking of poetry slams, right? All those are Chicago inventions. So, way before Nuyorican poets were taking on gentrification, or even Papoleto's early work, you wrote the first poem on yuppies. The first Nuyorican poem on yuppies is The Pestilence of Yuppies. That's yours, right? And you could see even in Papoleto's poem here from '67, right? A kind of awareness, right, of the outsider's gaze, right, in the barrio space, so it's really forward thinking. But by that point, the Division Street riots had already happened in Chicago, right? So we could say the Puerto Rican movement was organized. The Young Lords began, right, as a response to the politics of displacement and urban renewal, right? We just never think about it in those ways. So that kind of comparative study is waiting to be done. And these are just some haiku at the end of my book, showing future scholars, right, possible directions to take. So on that note, gracias por todo. Thank you.
If anyone would like to
Yes,
ask a question, make a comment, buy the book.
Okay, Buddha, you're on. You had to cut a lot out of your book, right?
Yeah.
Was that well, first of all, what was that decision?
Yikes, yeah.
Was that a paper decision? You know, because, okay, now that we could publish our own books, you know, on print on demand,
Sure.
we don't have paper issues. You know, you can make your book as fat as you want and whatever, you know, like
Yeah.
mine and so forth. But when you have a university press or some other press, they might give you that constraint. So my first, it's a two-part question. One, did you have to cut stuff from your book that you originally wanted in it, and was it a paper, you know, a paper issue? And then how'd you feel about it?
Yes, and messed up. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yes, and messed up. I mean, pretty much. I think I don't know other folks who published recently, but I think these days about 90,000 words is kind of the upper limit. And I think this book is 89,900 and something. So actually, the last part was even getting it somehow what I had under 90,000 words. I think that includes even major figures, people like Jack Agüeros. I thought, well, to include, he deserves to be included.
Right.
But if I don't contextualize him, I'm trivializing him,
I
right?
see.
So I wrote, how do you write a book on on Nuyorican poetry with no Jack Agüeros? Well, he's in the footnotes, right? I said, saying basically that. I can't contextualize him without trivializing him. I don't have room to contextualize him, right?
That's an interesting point.
Yeah, so I mean, and that's, I think, but again, I'm not finished writing about any of these issues. I'm working on an encyclopedia entry and hopefully a longer project looking at also comparative, right? Nuyorican, Chicano, right?
Because there's theater too.
There's theater, absolutely.
Yeah.
And, theater, visual arts, absolutely. Music, yeah.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
What was your take on the constant conversation between the Nuyorican School of Poetry and the Nuyorican Poets Cafe? And how the Nuyorican School of Poetry has kept its tradition and it has a tradition, but the Nuyorican Cafe constantly reinvents itself. And sometimes doesn't remember the foundation that it started on.
Yeah.
Yeah, you go do that. That's fine.
Well, this is school of poetry. This is school.
That is, it starts with the first generation, and then I always thought the second generation was with Willie, and
Oh, okay,
Tony,
I see what you're
and
saying.
Ruha,
No, I
and the
understand.
third generation was.
You're thinking of Willie's Nuyorican School of Poetry poem.
Oh yeah, no,
right?
I always thought that poem was good, but I always thought, how do you conceptualize the generations?
Yeah.
And how do you start with the originals, and then start with the whole thing with slam, with the conversations that myself and Shaggy Flores used to have,
Yeah.
was like, well, how do you maintain basically an imaginary school of poetry when there are non-Puerto Ricans coming out of a cafe but call themselves Nuyorican poets, but only by title, not by tradition? Because his thing was always that the Nuyorican school of poetry had a particular cadence, a particular delivery, outside of Ed being Ed and just being very different and vanguard than all of us kind of always had a very particular cadence and affluence on the way we spoke on things. But when they came out of the cafe as slammers and primarily performers, they're not necessarily paying homage to the people before them, they're just on the slam team.
Well, the first thing I'd say is look behind you, because Ed Morales pretty much, I think, wrote the book on that, right? Thinking of what Ed does in Living in Spanglish as somebody who was there, right, on the front lines in the allowed era. I mean, I would actually quibble. I mean, actually, I'm not sure how someone like Tato's, in Paz Descanse Tato, how his work is really representative, right? I think if you're thinking of the kind of post-Black arts, post-beat delivery of a lot of Nuyorican poets, I think that largely holds true. But I say someone like Tato to me seems to be closer to, I don't know, Juan Boria, right? Maybe, right, to Puerto Rican declamadores than he is to that kind of tradition. So I would even.
But the question is,
yeah.
how have you observed the school versus the cafe, which they're interlocked, because of the foundation,
Yeah.
but not necessarily complementary of
Sure,
each other.
sure. Well, the one thing is the history, predates the cafe itself, right? Thinking about Puerto's earliest work, that's way before, right? The cafe, even Puerto Rican obituary itself, right? 1969, right? If you count Victor Hernandez Cruz's snaps, which I do, I can't see how you couldn't, right? That's 69 or 68. So I think there's that, and also I think I discovered doing this book how many other spaces for Nuyorican poetry there were, and I mentioned some of those, right? But thinking you couldn't tell a story without the Boricua, without the Nuyorican village. And in fact, some of those debates you were having with Shaggy were playing out in the 70s, right? When folks were saying maybe we should hang out at the Nuyorican village instead, right? Because it's become too closely formalized, right? As a certain kind of poetry with a certain kind of agenda, and so my sense is in reality, the history of this poetry is a history of kind of strategic alliances, right, that are kind of, that kind of survive over time, but with significant divisions and fissures, right, within that. And those are strategic also. And also I think there are poets, I think, who don't benefit, right, from those kinds of those kind of strict chronologies. Some of the people I look in the book, Lorraine Sutton, right, I think whose work I think is super important, but I think doesn't really fit that periodization. She left New York too early, right, to really be part of the flourishing of that Nuyorican moment, but whose work I think formally and politically I think belongs in that tradition. So I'd say I get what you mean, but I see that debate as playing out multifocally, right, in a number of different spaces. Someone like Luis Rivera, right, how important is his work? And he's here too, but I see his work in the 70s largely as a critique, as does Juan Flores for that matter, of kind of Algarin's very narrow definition of the Nuyorican in his essays and in the anthology. So, yeah.
Is your poetry being included, or have you made any attempt to try to integrate this poetry into the middle school, well, the elementary, the middle, and the high schools, where many of our kids have been victims of cerebral and intellectual genocide by the educational bureaucracy, where now the threat is strictly test, test, test. Because many of our kids are now, regarding the Puerto Rican, we're into the third and fourth generation. And speaking as a retired bilingual Puerto Rican clinician in the public schools, where of course in the early 70s bilingual education flourished, where again the students were able to see the traditions of Puerto Rico and also the Nuyorican experience. So have you tried to integrate this into the curricula within our schools, especially as I said, the elementary, the middle, and the high schools,
Sure.
where so much damage is being done?
It's really in my own kind of higher education, right, day job I'd say also, as my work as a poet, groups like Urban Word have been doing that, right, thinking of worked at various poetry-centered groups, including the Centro's collective when they were around, we're also doing. But I think also there are scholars, I think, whose work addresses that directly, right? People like Regina Bernard Carreño and Nuyorican, thinking about the kinds of pedagogies, right, that taking seriously the questions Nuyorican poets ask, right? So in her take, it will lead to a radically different pedagogy, right, where we'd ask, where, for example, survival, right, in the way it's thematized and addressed, right, in this poetry, foregrounded as a value, right, pedagogical value, right? But also folks like Ana Celia Centella, right, her use of works of various Nuyorican poets to help us rethink, right, what is and is not, right, proper or official, right, English or Spanish, and so on, right? So I think some folks are organizing, both researching those topics, but also organizing around them. In terms of getting that into curricula, I think we kind of see the education moment that we're living in terms of standardized testing, right, and kind of moving away from that culturally centered, right, model of affirmation, but I can certainly direct you to folks within radical pedagogy. And again, I do know about groups like Urban Word that are doing some of this on the ground, and a number of the poets here, probably one if I can speak to his own, and Pablo for that matter also, right? You both work intimately, right, with schools, right? Santa Maria Teves, I know also, right?
In schools, you gotta be real careful because well, first of all, this language, this cursing, in the poetry, and like I've gotten into a lot of trouble.
Oh yeah.
Even Sice here, which he says, "God damn it." Look at here, look, goddammit. And I've gotten in trouble with that. I'm like, what are you talking to this guy?
That's nothing.
Right,
I was 20 years old, and I had a Cuban principal walking on me when I was reading Nuyorican Blues. And he walked in on me saying, "Spick, spick, spick. You ain't no different than a nigga." He comes at me, and I'm 20, so you know I'm still not totally comfortable talking to like 40-year-old men. And so I'm looking at him, and after that I told him, I go, "No one's ever gonna talk to me like that," because my whole class were all Dominican and Puerto Ricans in the South Bronx. So Urban Word, which is the company, the organization talk about, is a literary organization that puts teaching artists in schools. I've been with them for about 11 years now. And at one point, myself and Willie Perdomo were on the roster. They had Roger Bonnier-Gard. They had a lot of New York slammers and a lot of New York poets on it. Funny enough, the biggest thing is obviously funding. After the recession, I think our budget got cut 60%. And this is just from a real specific point of view. Is I'm still probably the only Puerto Rican on staff. I'm still the only one that gets sent to particular schools. I teach a class at a Franklin K. Lane High School, which is in Cypress Hills, but no one told me that it was a bilingual class. And I can speak Spanish and I can relate the messages, but we're talking about kids directly from like Santo Domingo who are still having issues with prepositions and nouns.
That's a big issue.
And you know, poetry can filter that. But they have to want to do it. Mm-hmm. You know, they just want to hang out.
Right.
They just want to chill.
Yeah.
And today was a really frustrating day because because the thing is, look, I was a high school dropout, and poetry changed everything.
Right.
Poetry changed everything. I think the first time I went to Nuyorican was '94. I was 17 years old, and I was like, wow, this is really amazing. And you know, Willie and Aloud, they changed the perspective. It's hard to, you know, crack through, you know, poetry, you know, to them it's still something totally different. But for me, I'm like, no, come on, if I can do it, I'm this kid from the Bronx, trust me, anyone can do it. But for them, language is the biggest thing as possible because they're still thinking in Spanish. So when you're talking about syllable breakdown, you know, bolígrafo was 4 syllables, a pen is 1. So to them it's totally, you know, the English teachers have a harder time because, you know, they need to read like real books and do book reports. So I would just say, you know, to support these institutions that put teaching artists still in schools.
Yeah, I just want to say that's an old tradition. Back Victor Hernández Cruz, I think, is one of his first gigs.
Oh yeah, no,
was with
he
teachers and writers
all the time.
when he was
It
a
was a
teenager.
different period.
Yeah.
I first met Victor at
Different
Teachers and Writers when he came in just a couple years ago. He came in, and that's where I first met him at Teachers and Writers. When they
Well,
were
I
still
gotta
using
say that Urban Word did not give me a job. I interviewed for
Well, you know, you had a guy on the inside, and you didn't use that
That's the
correctly.
good stuff.
I don't
It's not about what you do; it's about who you know.
Well, you know, I think it's about who I am.
No?
I think it's about that.
But the thing is, on a two-way street, one side of the street all know who you are, the other street doesn't know who
Well,
you
you
are.
know, I got there, I did the interview, you know, the interview was one student and the director. It was a very, you know, I just felt it was
What year was that?
lopsided.
What year was that? What year was that?
That's 2 years ago. You know, I still need that job.
I got you.
I want to say this. I have over 30 or 40 years experience of working in the schools. Really. I started teaching just after I wrote Message to Urban Sightseers. I taught a Regents class in Fieldston Upward Bound program up in Riverdale because I'm an alumni of the Fieldston School Upward Bound program, a government program that was set up when my English teacher, Mr. Mullen, recommended me. He said, "Papa, you should be in this." And we went up to Cooperstown, New York to a camp for 4 weeks, 2 weeks in May, 2 weeks in June, came back and aced all our Regents exams and everything. We, you know, took us out of the city. That's a great program. Should bring it back.
Fieldston is great. No, Fieldston
They would get kids from the ghetto and just put them in like a prep school and whatnot. Well, so no, I'm not happy with Urban Word, but I did work with Teachers and Writers. One of the founding members of Teachers and Writers, again, when I was 17 years old, because Teachers and Writers was putting poets in the classrooms, and they needed poets of color to go into the urban areas. And Felipe Luciano was one of them, and me, and Victor, and Pedro, reluctantly, because Pedro hated to teach workshops. You know, it meant getting up early, going somewhere, and behaving yourself.
And being sober.
And being sober, right.
Hey,
I
can say that.
Well, no, we got kicked out of a lot of schools for whipping out a bottle in the middle of a lecture. We did, okay? We were, you know, we were us. But what I want to say is that the Dominican kids, and pardon me, is a real struggle with them.
Yeah.
They have a lot of issues besides behavioral issues and so forth, which are really goddamn deep, and sometimes I can't, get through them. It's a battle, but the language thing and the culture thing, those are the most important things. Behavior, okay, but it is, it's kind of like being in McDonald's at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in the classroom.
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah,
It's
it's
a bit
wild.
wild.
It's wild. It's like McDonald's at 3 and you have 3:30
And they're
without the
bringing
food. And when they bring the lunches in, now the kids don't eat in the lunchroom. They eat in the classroom, and there are roaches and mice in the classroom because where they throw, they throw their lunches in their little stupid green pits. There's only one in the classroom, But what I wanted to say is that about schools, because you went off on a thing and it really wound me up because I've been working in the schools for many, many years. The first thing that impacted funding on the school was 9/11.
Yeah.
That attack, whoever did it, that attack was financial. That was an economic warfare because everybody that used to give money to United Way for the arts started giving money to United Way for firemen and everybody else that needed help. You can see the logic of that. So the arts started losing a lot of money after 9/11, and that's how we got a lot of depletion in our programs. But every poet will always tell you that poetry saved their life. If it wasn't for poetry, they'd be dead. Every poet will tell you that. And we're trying to get that message across to children, to young people, because it will do the same thing for them. And we as poets know that. And that's our struggle.
Yeah, it's frustrating.
It's Socratic. It's not, I tell them, this is poetry, not dentistry. We're not pulling teeth here. We're just trying to put idea. How
You need a
long
bumper sticker that says
Dentistry saved my life.
Yeah. How long do you want to walk around with that brain? Let's do so. It's a hard job, but teachers and writers and all these programs that we used to work with or try to work with, that's why we need jobs.
All right, any more comments on Urayuan's? Yes. Buck? Yes.
Sorry.
A question, yes.
Your research process. You mentioned the importance of the archive.
Yeah.
But I imagine that doing this work with Puerto Rican studies and poets, there's so much that you wouldn't find in a traditional academic archive. And I wonder if you can speak to any tension or conflicts that you encountered with archival research versus speaking with these people.
How long do you have? We could go on for a while. Just to pick up quickly on Pableto's point, one of I think the investments here is that we actually teach our own poets, right? To me, that was a kind of structure that was in place, right? Partly because the poets were also connected to the programs, right? So there was a kind of symbiosis that was happening that's not so much now. Now, I talked to Michael Dowdy, who's here. We invariably are the only two scholars who work on Latino poetry, right? Wherever we are, right? So it ends up being this kind of niche market. So there's a kind of disconnect between how important poetry can be as a teaching tool and as it's connected to hip-hop culture and lived experience and the kind of institutional, right, marginalization of it, right? So I think to connect those networks is one reason why I thought it was important to write about the younger poets also, to show that this is a living tradition, right, and not just a kind of chapter in literary history. But to the question of archive, definitely, I think oral histories were a big part, or interviews, a lot of stuff that I'm not trained to do as a lit geek, as a literature geek. I thought, well, how the heck do you do that, right? So Ed gave me some good ideas, right, coming from the kind of journalistic side. A couple of the anthropologists gave me some good ideas about just oral history, and also maybe asking kind of autoethnographic questions that put the poets in a kind of autoethnographic place. But certainly also working across archives, right? One of the things I wanted to do was to mobilize this archive digitally, right? So we could have access to it. What good is it if I've seen these random, right, VHS or beta clips from 1978 if nobody else who reads the book can, right? But then that gets into permissions issues and Centro's own lack of funding, so it all ties in, right? If Centro has one person to pretty much manage their entire archive, right? Then we're not going to get the kind of attention, right? So actually, when folks complain, folks who work in allied fields say, "Oh, the archives I work in, we're so underfunded." I'm like, "Yeah, come to Centro, right?" But we do, I think, important work because I think that really there's nobody else to do it. So I think in that sense, archiving is also a kind of social practice, and we're all I think responsible for that. So it involved at some point seeking out other archives. Naropa archives at Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado, or archives for the Sunbury Press at Brown University, right? So archives in Puerto Rico, a little bit of stuff there, right? So yeah, there was definitely a kind of both diversity of archives and also a broad definition of archives. Social media, to an extent, right? Getting in touch with social media folks saying, who's YouTube user, Nuyo Poeta 000, right? Say, hey, I see you posted these clips. Who are you? And where did you find that from? Give me the citation. Give me the reference. So it took a little bit of DIY, right? Attention. But what I think I'm hoping to do now is to expand that into a kind of broader digital database. It's depressing to me, especially now that I'm at NYU. NYU has this amazing downtown collection at the Fales Library, right? Where you can actually read, you can actually check out the hard drives of the punk rocker Richard Hell, meaning you don't, and he got paid good money for this. I mean, you can read every email Richard Hell sent if you wanted to each his own, right? But you can find almost nothing, right, on Nuyorican poetry, right? So again, that's a kind of the institutional, right, imbalance in terms of archives is something that I really hope to be able to correct. But it was just too much to take on given, so I need to, maybe now that I'm at NYU, an evil corporate university, I can direct some of those evil corporate resources and put them to good use, right?
Another evil companion.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, the house. Doesn't mean the people are evil, just
Yes, Ruben.
I was wondering, Johan, have you given any thought to the, I guess, disconnect between Puerto Rican poetry from the island and Puerto Rican poetry from the, I guess, the mainland, if one is to call it something. Is there a conversation underneath what appears to be this pretty radical disconnect, or what have you discovered?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the disconnect is real, right? And the sense that in my book, right, the Nuyorican canon is defined partly through its double exclusion, right? From general American literature and also from island Puerto Rican literature. So that's the point of departure, that's a given, right? But then, when I wrote this book was the moment of Gallego and Guillermo Rebollo Gil, right, and this kind of hip hop, right, renaissance in Puerto Rico, where folks were at least trying to read, because again, a lot of this stuff is out of print. Even Puerto Rican obituary is out of print for that matter, right? So think about how difficult that kind of conversation becomes when the books aren't there, right? But the book reflects a kind of moment when it felt like this conversation at least could be possible. Thinking of what Juan Flores and Mike Febres did for their special issue of Hostos Review, I think you're there, I'm there. So it felt that was possible at the time. It's weird to me, and I think Ed, you've written about also, for example, Gallego and Mariposa, right, and the kinds of conversations that are happening in that way. So I think certain people certainly are, and it seems to me it's better, right, than it was in a moment, and think about the old Nicolás Amor, Amarita Vega moment, right, and the kinds. So it's definitely not there, but it doesn't mean that some of the old structural issues aren't there. And I think also people kind of have to seek out this kind of poetry if they want to plug in. And sadly, even poets who I think of as progressive poets on the island doing good work don't necessarily see this as their poetry, even if they support it, right, politically and in spirit, right? I think there may be still a language issue there. It's different to say I read English than I feel comfortable, right, engaging with poetry in English, right? There's also questions of style, right? If Papoleto is right, and this poetry comes from beats and black arts, and you're coming from Neruda, right, or Pizarnik or whomever, right? You're going to end up with a very different definition of what socially engaged poetry looks like, right? So I think there are a number of issues there. And also I think the last one just to say is, again, publishing, right? Books from the island don't circulate here, right? So I think the other way around. Why are young Nuyorican poets not reading, forget about, Gallego, of course, but in Mara Pastor, right? That would be an amazing conversation if that were happening. I see so many points of contact, but, given the kind of significant obstacles, that's a kind of irony. It's a digital moment, we can all publish, it seems so easy, right? But the kind of networks don't seem to be there in ways that are, to get published respectably, right? In the ways in which you can sustain a career, right? That gets you gigs, right? Those networks aren't in place. So you can blog if you want, but those bloggers are not in place.
Do you know of any significant friendships between Puerto Rican poets from the island and poets from here? In the
Yes.
manner.
Oh, many, absolutely.
In the manner, for example, that I recall strong friendships between Manuel Ramos Otero and, say, Vanessa Ross in Puerto Rico. But then Manuel Ramos Otero is a particular kind of writer that's hard to pinpoint and locate. But are there significant friendships that you can recall that lasted over the years? I'm thinking more of early Nuyorican poets.
Sure. Well, certainly with Pietri, I mean, because Pietri also saw himself as kind of part of the broader kind of Puerto Rican left, right? In a way that probably Algarin did not, right? In my reading of that. So I mean, when at Pedro's funeral, I guess, and seeing Che Melendez there, for example, right? That was.
Yes, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
I thought particularly of Che and Pietri, and I was wondering if, because they were good friends and however they had very distinct poetic projects, but don't you find it curious that so much of Che's poetics is invested in this kind of Spanish that, special Spanish that he writes, which is he got rid of all the letters that do not sound in Spanish. Could it be possible to make some sort of connection between that and Pietri's experiments with Spanglish?
You could if you wanted to, I guess. I'm not going to do it.
From very different places and perspectives, the two of them had a very experimental approach to their uses of Spanish and their use of Spanish in their respective poetry.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly there was solidarity, right, on both sides, but I think they were also coming from just different poetic traditions, so it's hard to make one speak the other's language, although there are certainly points of overlap. I'd say the more contemporary vein, thinking of the work Willie Perdomo has been doing, right, and both going to the island and writing about it in his new book, which is fantastic, by the way. So I mean, writing kind of from the Nuyorican perspective about the ironies of island politics, and it's brilliant. I wish more island intellectuals read that, because it feels to me precisely he has the kind of intimacy and distance that I think I can bring to Nuyorican poetry, right? And I think Willie brings that to the island in a way that's really, to me, radical. And certainly Guillermo Rebollo and other folks have not only read, but responded to, been blurred by Willie, right? But I think that's also an affinity shared on, for example, transnational understanding of salsa, for example, right, and hip hop culture. So my hope was that hip hop would create that, and I think there was a moment with like Tego and the early reggaeton moment, because that was such a transnational moment, but it feels that faded out a little bit and nothing's taken its place. So I think, as usual, music is going to have to lead the way, because poetry is mediated, it's about language, and there are just difficulties associated with that. It probably will come from somewhere else, I'm guessing music or performance art or something like that.
Well,
so yeah, I think
I just remembered when I wrote about the thing with Gallego, he kind of reversed the Mariposa's phrase from the diaspora. That's the most direct thing I can remember recently.
Yeah.
Right? Puerto Rico, Nueva York nació en mí.
Yeah.
What's the right?
Yo no nací en Nueva York, Nueva York nació en mí, right?
Yeah. When Gallego was here, and I was with him and I had his first book and we all hung out, like he did have this huge respect for the Nuyorican, but I just haven't seen that since then. And it's not that they don't have it, there's no cross-pollination. And there are spaces in Puerto Rico that you can do it, but I still don't see it. When you were talking about music, the only thing that came to mind was the project that Miguel Zinon did. That he interviewed Juan Flores, me, and a couple of other people. But it's still not necessarily a poetry thing. It's more about identities are interchangeable. That was the name of the record. And when I heard that, I was like, okay, that works. My thing is like, who's gonna hear it? Like, what kind of promotion and will the Puerto Rican community support it? Even though my 82-year-old grandaunt is from Loma Verde, she has no clue what a Miguel Zinon is, and I'm just like, he's a MacArthur genius twice. Like he plays sax. She goes, yo no sé quién es. So it's people have to be able to share these things. You know, like I'm dying to go back to Puerto Rico. Every time I go to Puerto Rico, I can't ever do poetry. There's always a damn family vacation. But you know, when I go, I want to go and do readings and do all this. You know, go to Juanica and do a reading there, and everyone looks at me like I'm crazy because you know, my Spanish is horrible depending who you ask. You know, and it's because you know the question I always have with people, especially about Puerto Rican poets, is that Spanish and English, neither one of them makes us more Puerto Rican. But Puerto Rican poets from the island think that if we don't speak Spanish correctly with quotations, you know, we're easily less Puerto Rican than they are in that sense.
Yeah, that's historically largely true. I think that's changing somewhat, but I think there's also a deeper issue, which is, or a bigger issue, which is also class. Class changes both on the island and here, right? I think, I mean, in a way, you talk to like hip Puerto Ricans now here, the kind of Boricua hipsters that are ending up in Brooklyn,
yeah,
right? And they see this
never-
as a kind of joke. What we're doing, like ethnic, what are we, 1970s ethnic people, right? We're beyond that. We're like cool, plugged in. So there's
Shit
a
that
way in
kills
which
me
that's
with them
seen.
is that they never go to the barrio. They know, oh well, I don't go up there for I want to be in Brooklyn.
That's what I'm saying. There's
Yeah,
a sense
it's
that
ridiculous.
wherever the Puerto Rican, you want to call that the diaspora, we don't know what to call that, right? But that's beyond that somewhere. The history isn't there. And that becomes more interesting if we ask that question of, say, Orlando, right? Where you have the kind of clash of the two. You have, right, middle class Puerto Ricans from the island and from the diaspora, right? Who are both, you know, going there for quality of life reasons, or el calor, or being closer to folks, or lo que sea, right? But then you also have this working class that's, you know, doing a lot of the dirty work, right, for that middle class. So these kinds of class oppositions are being foregrounded, I think, in a way that makes it hard to think about the kind of kind of old school, right, salsa, you know, populism that I see, in someone like Gallego, right? And then, rightly or wrongfully, that seems to be a lot of the kind of cooler Ricans.
I worked there for 1 year.
Oh man.